Hello, and welcome to Message in the Middle with Marianne. We all know that life is hard, right? It's messy, it's unpredictable, but it can be wonderful all at the same time. My hope is that we can take a deep dive into self-development topics and explore life's lessons through book clubs, conversations, and interviews. And together, we can uncover the lessons that others have already learned to help us navigate this crazy, wonderful ride called life. Hello and welcome back to Message in the Middle. I'm your host, Marianne, and today we're talking about something that can be incredibly difficult to recognize, hard to name out loud, and often even harder to step away from. We're talking about domestic or intimate partner violence, what it really looks like, how it shows up in ways that are often overlooked, and what it takes to begin healing and rebuilding. Even if this isn't something you've personally experienced, I think you'll want to listen in because chances are someone you love has. Joining me for this topic is Alli O'Malley, someone who brings both lived experience and deep professional insight to the conversation. As a survivor of both family and intimate partner violence, Alli understands firsthand how these dynamics unfold and how difficult they can be to name, and that experience has shaped everything she's gone on to build. For 12 years, she served as a CEO of Resolve of Greater Rochester, New York, where she led a trauma-informed, human-centered approach to care and worked to shift how healthcare and community systems respond to abuse, recognizing it as a critical factor in overall health and well-being. Through her leadership in the Rochester-Monroe, New York County Domestic Violence Consortium and her work with court-mandated offenders, Alli has seen this issue from every angle. Today, as an author, speaker, and founder of Thistle Rose Coaching and Consulting, she helps women move beyond simply surviving what they've been through and into a place of healing, clarity, and forward movement. This conversation is about learning to recognize what we have minimized, finding language for experiences that have been hard to explain, and understanding that healing doesn't mean staying defined by what happened to you and being able to go on and come out of it in a very positive way. Alli, welcome to the show.
That was quite the lovely introduction. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're very, very welcome. So we joked before the show about the intro, but I think it encapsulated all that you have been through and are bringing to the table and bringing to this conversation. And I think where I want to start with that is the obvious, probably, your lived experience, because I'm really curious about what made you decide to share your story, because that's a big deal, putting it out there for everyone.
Well, one of the stories that's actually in the book is the first time I shared my story in a speech and the impact that I realized that I could have by sharing my story. I was volunteering actually with the agency that I ended up taking over, and I wanted to be a mentor when I signed up to work with this organization, but they said, well, we've had trouble in the past with survivors working with people who are going through it, and we would rather not assign you to that role for your safety and for the safety of our clients. But is there any other way you can help us? So I jumped in to help with marketing, and then they asked me if I would be willing to start a speakers bureau. And I enjoy public speaking. I know a lot of people really don't, but I do enjoy it. And that was the first time I actually sat down and tried to come up with a way to share my story in 20 minutes in a way that would be impactful for people. And it was a challenge to do that. And, my voice was shaking the very first time that I tried to share my story publicly.
I bet.
And I looked up at the audience and I wasn't being judged. I mean, that's what I was afraid of, that people were going to judge me. I saw people really riveted and some people shaking their head in recognition, actually nodding in recognition. I saw people dabbing their eyes. I saw people connecting to what it was that I had to say. And at the end of the talk, I was really amazed at the number of people who came up to me and had the courage to share that they had also been touched in some way by this experience. And one woman in particular who approached me in the cloakroom. We were putting our coats on, and she tapped me on the shoulder. Her eyes were just filled with tears, and she said, "You gave word to something that I have never, ever been able to describe."
Hmm.
And, we stood together for a while as she shared some of her own experience, and she'd never gotten any help. She didn't feel like she deserved to get help. And she said, "He's gone now, but the impact isn't gone.
Yeah.
And my kids are a mess. And I didn't know how to protect them.
Mm.
And our relationships are a mess." And so I knew then that I needed to continue to do this work. And then that experience stayed with me when I was leading my agency. And when kind of the heaviness of running an agency got to be too much, I decided that I was going to take a step back from that role and write and find other ways to do the work that was meaningful to me.
It really is those moments when people connect with you and they give you feedback and you just know that you somehow impacted them even just a little bit, that keeps you going when you're in this kind of service work. So I'm so happy for you that you had that experience early on in your speaking career about it. When you think back to your own experience, and I guess I'm interested in sort of the earliest signs, because I think, we talk about, and we'll get more into it, about how sometimes it goes unnoticed or unnamed, or we don't have the words, or we're not quite sure. When you look back, of course, hindsight is very different than when you're in it. But now that you look back with all the knowledge you have, what were some of the earliest signs that something was really wrong there?
I can answer that question in the context of being a young person growing up in a home which had violence and abuse in it. And I can also answer that question in the context of being a young adult with an abusive partner. So I think that there's really two answers. When I was 15, my father and I really struggled. My parents were long divorced, but I was living with my father, and the conflict was not normal teenage conflict.
Mm.
And, I'm a very faithful person. I'm a Christian person. I grew up in the church, and my church was a safe place for me. And there was this voice, kind of an inner voice, that said to me, "The way your dad is treating you is just not right. This isn't right." And so as a 15-year-old, I pushed back. And it just got worse.
Yeah.
It didn't get better, as this normally does.
Yeah.
And so I ended up leaving my father's home and going to live with my mother. And it was not an easy process, but that was the first time I listened to that kind of inner knowing, and said, it's not okay to be treated this way.
Mm.
So I found my way out then. And then, very interestingly, I met the man that I would marry less than 6 months later.
Wow.
And I was 16.
Mm.
And, I didn't see it at the time, but I just replaced
Yeah.
the father in my life with this peer.
Yeah.
And, he treated me very differently than my father at the beginning. He treated me like a queen. And I had never been treated so nicely. And I really thought that's what love was. And we were the same age. So there wasn't a huge age disparity here. There wasn't anything like that. We were really peers. But his controlling behavior started almost immediately.
Mm.
And that, it looked like not wanting me to do things that I enjoyed doing because it meant that we couldn't be together. He wanted to be together all the time. And at that stage, it was really fun to be together a lot.
Sure.
So I wanted to be with him a
Yeah.
lot. And so I started saying, well, do I want to run track anymore? Or maybe I'll give up track and spend time with him.
Yeah.
And then, as our relationship progressed, the requirements to be in the relationship just compounded.
Mm.
And anything that I wanted for myself was always a problem, always a problem. And, I had that feeling about a year into the relationship, well, when we were still dating, that this wasn't the right relationship for me. And I couldn't figure out how to get out of it at that early on. And another year or so passed, or 6 months or so passed, and I did try to end the relationship after a number of challenging things happened with us. Um, at that point, we were actually engaged. I was a senior in high school and already had an engagement ring on my finger because he was going into the army and I was going to go live with him as soon as I graduated. But I wanted to I wanted to end the relationship, and he tried to commit suicide
Mm.
when I told him it was over. And so I ended up staying, obviously.
Yeah.
I was not actually, I want to say no, not obviously, but in the mind of an 18-year-old girl, and I really was a girl.
Yeah.
I wasn't a woman, even though we try to tell people when they're 18, they're grown-ups. We're not grown up. We're grown up at 18. So I kept it a secret, and that was a really, really big price to pay. Keeping that secret took 7 years of my life. I stayed with him until I was 25. And the final decision to leave him actually wasn't a decision that I made for me. It was a decision that I made when he threatened to harm a coworker's children. And I couldn't accept that he would do that to somebody else. And I knew at that point I had to leave to save them.
Wow.
It took a long time for me to see that I needed to leave for me.
I think that's so important for people to hear, because I have had somebody very close to me who has gone through a very similar experience. Not the part about your father, but the part of the boyfriend young and then it turning into something very similar. And I think, we live in a judgy world, but I think it's very easy for even friends and family, once they start sort of cueing in on some of it, to wonder why, to wonder how, to wonder why it's not obvious to the person in it. And I think it's so subtle sometimes. And you kind of, you said it and then you alluded to it a couple times. I think it's very easy with lots of quotes, when somebody's getting physically beaten up. There's no gray area. There's definitely abuse. Nobody's going to argue that, right? But I think when it's more of the subtle controlling, manipulation, mind games, belittling, all that stuff, you probably have way more words than I do. I think it's really hard for people to recognize with certainty that they're in it, and then for their people to understand it and support them in it. Does that make sense?
It absolutely makes sense. Yeah. In fact, when I finally went to counseling, I found a therapist after having a miscarriage in that marriage, and was describing to her the feelings I was having about the miscarriage. And, she asked me a question about how my husband treated me on the heels of the miscarriage. And, I had a hard time even hearing the question. And as I described our experience, she said to me, "Do you know that's abuse?" And, I didn't know. I really, really didn't know. And it's because abuse was all I'd ever known.
Mm.
So it was normal. It was normal. I really didn't understand that controlling behavior wasn't normal behavior in men. My father was exceedingly controlling, and then I met this boyfriend who treated me in much the same way.
Yeah.
And so I just kind of thought that's what the world was like. I didn't know that things could be different. And that question just changed. It rocked my world. It absolutely rocked my world.
I bet.
And, I'm very lucky that I ended up with a therapist who recognized violence and abuse
Yeah.
and recognized it as more than bruises and broken bones.
Yeah. Without you
Because,
saying it, without you saying it.
yeah, I couldn't, I never would have said it.
Right.
I never would have said it.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and that for me is part of the reason, a big reason that I wrote the book is when I think back to our agency and the number of women that we helped thousands of women in the years that I was there. And I would say 80% of the women that came through our door grew up in homes where abuse was normalized.
Hmm.
And so they too didn't really recognize the violence and abuse in their life. And so today, in 2026, we have language for these kinds of relationships, and we use the language of coercive control. And it is one of the most destructive forms of violence and abuse because it is not visible
Yeah.
and because the criminal justice system doesn't acknowledge it in most states, even today. And the title of my book is More Than a Crime, because when you're living with coercive control, there's no evidence. The evidence cannot be produced in a court in a way that is discernible. And so, that's where this he said, she said kind of stuff comes into play when couples are trying to get divorced. And, there's this it's beyond unhealthy, this very destructive dynamic of control and manipulation that's happening that the court just can't see. They can't see it in the financial disclosure document. They can't see it in the way things are being negotiated. They think that the parties are courts will often call them high conflict divorces, for example. And they just think that the couple is being difficult and not navigating the process. But the reality is it's much, much more dangerous than that.
I'm curious about what you would say. I'm sure you've counseled lots of people over the years. How do you draw that line? So if somebody today, if you had a niece or a neighborhood kid, teenager that came up to you, or I don't care what the age actually, but they're not sure.
Yeah.
Maybe they're hearing some of these things and they're starting to say, well, he doesn't like when I go out with my friends. And I guess we should say it's not always he. It could be either. But for generalization, I'm always going to default
Absolutely.
just because it's going to come out that way. But it could be either. But we'll say he doesn't like me to go out with my friends, or he doesn't like my family. They don't understand him, so we steer away from my family. Like these much more subtle things. How would you tell that person to be able to identify, no, that crosses the line. That really is a case of abuse. What's that line?
Yeah, it's a great question. First of all, I think that we all have that, I talked about that little voice inside me that said, this isn't right the way I'm being treated.
Yeah.
I think we all have that voice. And it's that voice that makes us ask the questions you just asked. Something really isn't right here, but it's not blatant. So it's hard for me to discern whether or not this is right or not right. Most of us aren't really taught to listen to that inner voice.
100%.
So if somebody asks me that question, I really like this person and they put a lot of pressure on me to spend all my spare time with them. I'm not sure that that's normal, right? Because after the infatuation stage of a relationship, that pressure becomes burdensome.
Yeah.
That jealousy becomes a thorn in your side because there's no reason for them to be exerting that pressure on you. And it's in those, it's kind of post-infatuation stage when that kind of behavior continues that we need to teach people that those are the red flags. And so I don't know that I would ever say to anyone who might ask me a question about my partner just wants to spend all his time with me and I'm not sure that I want to do that. I don't think I would just immediately go to a place of, well, then that's abuse. Because I don't think it's that cut and dry.
Yeah.
We all have to navigate relationships. We all have different levels of tolerance, I guess is the way to put it. So my question when somebody asks me that is, how does it make you feel? What is making you think that maybe this isn't right? Do you feel uncomfortable when they ask you to give up something that's meaningful to you? Are you struggling with not being in relationship with your family right now with this person? Because sometimes those family dynamics, abusive partners who use coercive control are just really good at honing in on that thing your mother does that bugs you and then aligning with you that and then making it much, much bigger so that you actually start to believe them.
Yeah.
Instead of remembering all of the good things your mother does and that one thing that really drives you crazy.
Yeah.
So I think when people ask about, is this, is people will rarely ask, is this abuse? Right? That's a different question. People ask more like, what's the difference between an unhealthy relationship and an abusive relationship?
Hmm.
And even that answer comes down to, how does it make you feel?
I guess that's why it's so difficult, right? Because there isn't a line in the sand. There isn't a very specific answer. And even the how does it make you feel, to your point about everybody has different tolerances, it could bother you and impact you, and it could roll right off my shoulders. So I guess, yeah, I guess you have to take all of it into account when you're looking at that.
And some of the other things that I might also probe are the level of threat that a person feels when they make a choice. So I don't like it when you spend time with this group of friends. Is it just that they don't like it, or does it feel like there's a threat tied to
Mm.
that somehow?
Or a punishment.
Or a punishment. So,
Yeah.
if it's instead of saying, if you spend time with them, I'm leaving you, it's if I don't like it when you spend time with them, but you feel like if you do it, they're going to leave you. Right. So
Yeah.
there's a threat or an imposed consequence.
Yeah. So I'm curious, you spent 12 years leading Resolve. Talk to me a little bit about what that experience specifically taught you about. How do communities and I guess our systems fail our, I'm going to use the word survivors. I know that's not a word you
I
love,
like,
but
no, I like survivors. I don't like the word victim. So I like
okay.
survivors.
All
Yeah.
right. All right. What have you seen that shows up as a repeated pattern of failure by our communities and the people that support the survivors?
That's a gigantic question. We don't have enough time, but I'll give you a few things. So, the number one challenge that I see in kind of the systemic response to intimate partner violence is every aspect of the system, whether it's advocacy, children's services, each one of those systems has an inherent bias, and their bias leads their response.
Sure.
And in that, they stop listening to the survivor
Mm.
and they impose control on the survivor.
Mm.
So, in essence, the systems do to the survivor what their partner has been doing to them forever. And many, many survivors are conditioned to try to respond in a way that's going to make them okay, even if doing what the system is asking them to do doesn't feel right to them. And so, how does anybody ever heal?
Yeah.
You're kind of like out of the frying pan into the fire. And it becomes easier for a lot of survivors to just go back to that abuser because what they're asking me to do, I don't understand. It's scary and it feels bigger to me than what I kind of know how to navigate.
Mm.
So that sounds a little strange, but I think that's the experience. Survivors know what they need. They know what they need. And if we listen to them, they will tell us. And then the systems need to support them in what looks like the next best thing for them. So let me try to give you an example because that might be helpful.
Sure.
So when I decided to leave my partner, I I did it because I realized that the threat against my coworkers' kids was a ploy. I realized that it was a ploy. He probably wasn't going to follow through on it, but if I responded to him, I was back under his control.
Mm.
And I finally got to a place where I recognized that the choice wasn't about saving those kids or accommodating my partner. The choice was really about saving myself. And so that was the day I I saw the game, I saw the control finally and said, I'm going to make a choice and I'm going to choose me. That is the And now I did not have children, and I think that's an important distinction.
I agree.
However, I'm going to add a caveat. Any child who's living in the presence of violence and abuse, even if they're not in the direct line of the violence, is being harmed. So parents need to know that because so often people will justify staying in these relationships because they don't want to break up a family.
Yeah.
And that is a beautiful, heartfelt intent. However, what those children are witnessing sets them up in their adult lives for more violence and abuse. So if a father or a mother do not treat the opposite partner, or in same-sex relationships, if the adults in the relationship do not treat each other with care and respect and model that for their children will never know that relationships should be structured on care and respect. So I want that to just be a thought. So I decided that I needed to leave because there was some part of me that decided that I deserved better.
Mm.
It was a teeny weeny little inkling of a thought,
That's all it took.
but it was there. That's
Yeah.
all it takes.
Yeah.
You know, one of my favorite healing kind of messages that I've read somewhere is as much as we are doers, we are deciders.
Mm.
And so often we just focus on the doing,
Yeah.
right? Breaking the cycle of abuse and violence in your life is about deciding
Yeah.
that you matter.
Mm-hmm.
So in that moment, it took a threat to some innocent children that weren't mine to make me decide I matter.
Mm-hmm.
I've got to get out of this situation. And that was the catalyst. But that tiny little inkling of I deserve better was the thing that helped me find my way out.
Mm. I love that for you. You talk about something that I have not heard before. So you talk about domestic violence as a social determinant of health.
Yeah. Mhm.
What does that really mean?
So when so social determinants of health are the environment in which we live, the food we eat, the community space that we live in, the maybe the schools that we go to, or the nature of the roads we drive on, and the expectations that we have of the world around us. And when you live with violence and abuse, you have social factors that are affecting your health and your well-being.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just that you might be bruised or have, be pushed around physically that can affect your health. When you're living with an abusive partner who is, another phrase that's really common today is narcissistic abuse. You see that all over social
Yes.
media.
Yes.
A lot of this language drives me absolutely bonkers because we just attach to it. We don't really know what it means.
Yeah.
But it taps into that anger that we feel about it. And then we're just really mad about it. Anger has its purpose. It's really important, actually, in energizing you to leave an abusive relationship. But at the end of the day, it doesn't make you take responsibility for yourself and what your future looks like. When you're living with violence and abuse in any form, it affects your well-being, your health. And so that's why I see this as a social determinant of health, because I went to my doctor looking for help to feel better. I couldn't describe that I was being abused because I didn't understand that.
Mm.
But the abuse was having consequences on how my body responded. So I had, fluctuations all the time throughout my life. I was either eating to compensate for the distress that I was feeling, or I was dieting like a maniac to try to lose the weight so that I would feel better about myself. I had shortness of breath issues when I was living with my partner. I was literally so oppressed that like I had a hard time breathing. I had headaches and, probably what would be described as irritable bowel syndrome, but I had, issues with constipation or diarrhea or what have you. And it was my body trying to navigate the distress that I couldn't figure out in my head.
Yeah.
So healthcare providers are such important partners in this work because in addition to 1 in 2 women specifically dealing with intimate partner violence, um, the vast majority never make a report to law enforcement,
Yeah.
but they show up at their doctor's office over and over again with complaints. There was never really any root cause determinations of these many, many complaints that I had
Yeah.
about my health and just not feeling good. And
So there's a missed opportunity there for sure.
yes, it's so, so important that,
Mm.
when a doctor, primary care doctor, an OBGYN has a patient who's showing up repeatedly with uh, urinary tract infections or yeast infections, and there's no clear explanation as to what's happening and causing this, they really need to go down the line of more than that boilerplate question that almost every woman's heard is, do you feel safe at home?
Yeah.
The world's worst question. The question they should, that you can't resolve this in one question because that's a really scary question to say yes to.
Yeah.
So healthcare providers are really important partners in helping a survivor recognize that when you're living amidst violence and abuse and you don't know what to do about it, it's going to manifest in illness.
Mm. That makes a lot of sense. I get it now. Thank you for that. I want to talk about you've mentioned it a couple times. So your book, which is More Than a Crime, One Survivor's Mission of Hope in the Shadow of Domestic Violence. I think that's the whole name, if I got it right.
Yes.
You talk about justice and healing not being the same thing.
Right. Yeah.
And that confusing the two leaves many survivors behind.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I thought that was an interesting point that probably doesn't get enough press. Why did that stand out for you enough to make you want to use some of your precious space in the book to talk about that?
Well, because my own story, I really didn't use the criminal justice system at all.
Mm.
When the majority of us aren't reporting to criminal justice, then criminal justice can't be the answer, right?
Right.
It's the answer for people who go looking there for answers. But it's first of all, it's essential that violence in intimate relationships is considered a crime. That is absolutely essential. So I'm not disputing that at all. But the question is does the process that you are asked to follow yield anything that contributes to your healing?
Mm.
And that answer is different for every person. But I do think it's interesting right now when we look at the world that we're living in and we look at the fight, for example, among the Epstein survivors and trying to leverage justice in their experience.
Yeah.
And the response of the justice system being non-existent, basically. Domestic violence survivors have that same response the vast majority of the time. So the majority of domestic violence, not what you see on 2020, not what you see on Dateline, because those are the worst of the worst. And sadly, those stories don't even mention domestic violence most of the time.
Right.
But here's a newsflash. If one partner kills another partner, it's domestic violence every single time. But we just don't label it that way. We make it sensational somehow.
Yeah.
So in the vast majority of cases that intersect with the justice system, somebody gets beaten up terribly. They end up in the hospital. And the criminal justice system, when it plays out, if it's the first time that partner has been caught doing something terrible, they're going to be offered a plea deal.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So what was a potentially life-changing traumatic situation for me gets met by the justice system with what amounts to feeling like a slap on the wrist.
Yeah.
To me, as the person who lived it. who endured the crime.
And often re-traumatized, because I know people talk about being traumatized by the courts and the process.
Yes.
And it's just,
Yes. Yeah.
I get
Right.
that.
So, from the outside looking in, we want to believe that bad person does a bad thing, good person tells somebody about it, and then justice is served. And we want to believe that justice looks like some sort of punishment for the perpetrator, and the victim feels better because the perpetrator was punished.
Yeah.
But there's just so many degrees of what the justice system actually can do for a person who offends. And perspective, I'm going to use the word victim here because in the criminal justice system, the person who's been harmed is a victim.
Yeah.
The victim doesn't really have any control over the decisions that the justice system makes. So if the district attorney decides to offer a plea for an assault that's not a felony, and it's very, very difficult for the charges to end up at the felony level. So the vast majority of domestic incidents are misdemeanors or even lower than that, harassment charges. And so the experience of that for me as the victim in this case feels so much bigger than the response that I get from the criminal justice system.
Yeah. And I think it's probably also worth saying, and tell me if you feel differently, even if in the crazy rare circumstance that the perpetrator got the book thrown at them, that doesn't mean it's going to mean healing for the person that was the victim or the survivor, however we want to look at it. But I think I get the point, and I think separating the two makes a lot of sense for that reason as well, because they truly aren't necessarily tied together.
They're not for every survivor. For some survivors, knowing that their partner was punished in some way by a third party says, this happened to me, it was validated by the system, and that's really important to me. And that if that is how they feel, then they should pursue it.
Yeah.
And then there are a lot of survivors who I can speak for myself because I didn't want to see my partner punished. And in this book, there were numerous things that were done to me that were punishable by the justice system. And I couldn't see my partner as a criminal. Like that was not something I could get my head around because I knew the man. I knew the human being. I saw the struggle. I just could never let go of the potential of who the human being was. I loved that person.
I want to ask about
Mhm.
that. I want to ask about that because the person that I'm thinking of all the while you're talking, it's a very similar situation. And so how do we hold people accountable, acknowledge what they did, or how is there room to hold people accountable, acknowledge what they did, and I'm almost afraid to say it, and still have compassion for them without minimizing what happened?
Right. Oh, yeah. This is the heart of domestic violence work. And this is what makes it so complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is what makes it so complicated. So the person that you love or care about who's dealing with this in their own life, your protective instinct comes out and you want them to set some limits and take control of what they can choose to control instead of allowing this other person to continue to control them because you want better for this person that you care about.
Sure.
And they are still clinging to the dream, the desire, the wish for
Yeah.
whatever that relationship,
The
the
love.
love that
Yeah.
they still feel for this person.
I think also there's an element of an outsider can also potentially have compassion for the other person, for the perpetrator, because maybe they saw what kind of upbringing they had. Maybe they, recognize that they have health issues that can cause this to spike. I don't know. There's lots of factors. I am aware of that. But so I think there can be compassion not only from the person in the relationship, but even from people outside of the relationship. And then I think that feels sort of yucky. Like, why do I feel bad for the person that's the perpetrator.
Because you're human and you're a nice person.
Hmm.
I mean,
Yeah, I mean, it is true for me also, but
yeah,
I think people need to hear
yeah,
that, right? That's a human,
yes,
as you said, it's
it
complicated
is
and
complicated. It's complicated. And
it's the heart of it.
right. So, and that's where, the nuances of what somebody is willing to accept in a relationship is really up to that person. And it can be so
Mm.
incredibly painful as a sibling or a close friend or a parent of somebody who's watching someone be abused and know that they're just making that choice.
Yeah.
And it's frustrating and it's painful. And really, the single most important thing we can do is just love. You don't have to love the offender, and you don't have to let them in your relationship with that person. If you choose to continue one, you don't have to tolerate that behavior.
Hmm.
But the person who is choosing to stay in the relationship needs to know that you love them
Without judgment,
without judgment.
and that you'll be there when they're
Yes.
ready to reach
Yep.
a hand out.
Yep. And that
Yes.
is really, really hard. It's really, really hard.
Hmm.
And there also has to be some healthy boundaries because sometimes when you're living with an abusive person, you find yourself in desperate circumstances and you go to that person who loves you and you ask them to loan you money or you ask them to watch your children again for the nth time or
Yeah.
this, in some other way your crisis is impeding on this other person's life.
Yeah.
And it's okay for you to have boundaries with that person to say, I love you and I'm here for you, but I can't do these things for you anymore.
Hmm.
Because in setting those boundaries, you're demonstrating what healthy love looks like. And you're inviting them to think about the compromises this other person is endlessly asking them to make for love.
So important. So important. I'm glad we touched on that. I want to make sure we have time to also touch on the work you're doing with Thistle Rise coaching and consulting. I know one of the things before we hit record, I mean, one of the things we talked about briefly was sort of the upside of after your relationship and you rebuilding your whole life and you're obviously very successful in your career and all the things you've done and are still doing. Tell us a little bit about the work you do, but also in a way that maybe could guide someone that's listening if they're trying to be there for somebody else. What are sort of some of the things that you can help someone sort of find themselves again, find their confidence, find their voice, build their life, all those things? I know that was a lot, but I think it's the heart of the work you're doing now. So,
Yeah, yeah. So the work that I do through Thistle Rise is I work with survivors and I also work with people who love survivors who are struggling
mm,
to figure out how do I continue to be in this person's life and take care of myself in the process. And so they're two different things, but they're very closely related.
yeah,
Most people who love somebody who's living with abuse, they don't know where to turn,
yeah,
right? There's no hotline for them to call. It's true, you actually can call a domestic violence hotline and say, I'm terribly worried. And they'll talk to you for in the moment, right? But maybe you need somebody that you can lean on a little bit more than that. Maybe
yeah,
you need a little bit more support than that, and that's okay. So having someone who understands how hard it is to be present to somebody who is being abused and to allow your own heart to break for that person without having that spill over on them because they can't do anything. They can't do anything with it. And learning, how do I set a healthy boundary with this person? How do I stay in their life and not get consumed by my fear or my anger at the other person?
yeah,
Or if they have children who are part of your life, how do you not find yourself interfering somehow in the parenting of those children? And because it's coming from a place of loving them and wanting to protect them, but at the same time, it really complicates the whole scenario.
yeah,
Although it's super important that those kids know that there's somebody in their world that's safe, right? And that they can count on. So I I meet people where they are around this issue of violence and abuse, which is a space where not a lot of people are comfortable.
I actually have not heard of anybody working in this space before. And I can tell you that I talk to, hear from hundreds of coaches a week. I don't talk to hundreds, but I hear from, people pitch to be on the show or whatever. And I can honestly say I've not heard of this before. So it sounds like a much needed space. And I'm glad you're there.
Yeah, it's really important because very few people are comfortable sitting in the space of the threat of violence or abuse and the fear that surrounds that. So that is one of the gifts of my experience, is that I can be in that space and be supportive. And then with survivors, my primary role in what we did when in my agency with our intervention, survivors and often the people who love them see them as in a place of deficit.
Yes.
We don't see them in the strength, and we don't see how much strength it takes for them to endure every single day. So I see the survivor in their potential the way they may still be seeing their partner's potential.
I love that you
Right.
just said that, because I'm taking myself back there, and I can see that part of seeing the person in their potential, but I never, ever would have thought about seeing the ability to sustain through it as a strength, to keep going through it as a strength. It just never would have even it didn't cross my mind. So that is a really great perspective to put out there.
And we don't say that to survivors very often, but if we see and recognize that they're incredibly strong.
Yeah.
They are holding their families together with every ounce of energy that they have.
Yeah.
And it's all they know. So they don't see that as strength. And society and culture tells them that they're weak
Yeah.
and that they're useless. And that may even be what their partner's telling them. But it is so far from the truth. So if I can help them begin to see themselves honestly, and then invite them to say, how do I use my strength to my own benefit instead of to my detriment?
Gosh, I love that. I love that perspective. Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
If I only walk away with one thing, I am thrilled that I just walked away with that perspective, because it seems so obvious now after talking about it, because someone is really strong for standing through. We all go through a lot of things, but whatever, it's hard. So there is definitely a strength there, and recognizing that I can see the importance of it. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Is there anything else in the book? I know there's a lot, but is there anything else that you want to pull out and highlight in the short few minutes we have left, just to make sure we put it out there on the table?
I think the thing that was hardest for me to write about, I think, in the book is shame binds so many survivors and people who've lived with violence and abuse. And when we feel shame, we want to hide. And so the process of healing from domestic violence, and trauma in general, is just healing happens in relationship. We can't heal those hurting parts of us on our own. And when we've been betrayed by someone who is supposed to love us, it's hard to trust somebody enough to allow what you internalize as brokenness to be visible by other people.
Yeah.
But it's not until we bring that brokenness to someone and dare to trust again that we can begin to heal. And so Harville Hendrix is a popular couples therapist, and he talks about, healing happens in relationship. We're wounded in relationship, and we heal in relationship. If we all just lived on a little island, we would never be hurt, right? So if I could wave my magic wand one day and say, if you have been harmed as a child in an abusive home, or you've been harmed in an intimate relationship, it wasn't your fault, and you deserve to be supported in healing and growing, and you don't have to be ashamed. You didn't cause it.
I love that. So I was going to wrap up with asking you what I always wrap up, and that is, if our listener can only take away one thing from this, what would you want it to be? Is it what you just said? Because that was so beautiful.
Yes,
Or
I
is
think
there
so.
anything else?
I think so. The funny little phrase that's, bounces around all the time, but that Winnie the Pooh phrase of "you are stronger than you think,"
Yeah.
that really, really applies in this domestic violence work. You are just so much stronger than you think.
Mm,
And you'll never realize that though, unless you tell somebody what's
absolutely.
happening.
Absolutely. Well, I want to
Yeah.
thank you for being here today. And I will be putting the link to the book in the show notes so folks can find you. And it's been fabulous. And I need to do a shout out before we wrap and say thank you to our friend Wendy Gladstone Brown, who introduced us to each other and suggested that we do a podcast together, because I think this is a great topic, and your book's going to be filling a space that's much needed, as well as the coaching community. So good luck. I offer you good luck with that. Thank you so much for talking to me today.
Pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to today's episode of Message in the Middle. I hope you found something in this conversation that reminded you that you're not alone, and that midlife isn't about winding down. It's about waking up. You're not done. You're just becoming. If this episode speaks to you at all, please share it with a friend who needs to hear it. And if you're enjoying the show, I'd be so grateful if you could take a moment to leave a review. It really helps other women find this community and this podcast. Until next time, take care of yourself.